So my name is Christian Steinrücken. I'm going to talk about compressing human text. And so really, I'm very happy to be here and to see so many machine learners in one place. I have to add that a lot of data compression isn't run by machine learners, and there are a lot of computer scientists who mainly focus on writing algorithms. And on the one hand, it's a really difficult thing to compress text and to come up with algorithms that actually work. And I'm very proud to be presenting joint work with Zubin Garamani and David Mackay on a new data compressor. So what are we compressing? So here's randomly sampled bits, and that's incompressible. There's no way we could store this file more compactly than by just storing the bits as they are. That's because the information content of that file is exactly as large as it is. We cannot squeeze that any more at all. Then perhaps a more realistic sort of thing could be that data. So this is a text file, and if you stare at the zeros and ones a little bit, you'll see that there's a lot of repetition. If you squint your eyes, you will see lines appear, and that's because most of the ASCII characters actually start with the same signature. So there's a lot of structure, and that sort of structure can be exploited and can ultimately be compressed. And of course, we care about all sorts of other things. We may want to care about, compressing the latest viral thing from YouTube or other parts of the world. And the question is, how can we write models that model these sequences, and how can we write algorithms that do that? So sequences are more or less ubiquitous in our world, and human text is just one example. There are also computer programs and genomic data, and of course, once we store something in a computer, the computer ultimately makes a sequential representation of the thing in one form or another. And really, one important message is that these sequences are all very, very different. So if we have human text, for example, it has very different characteristics from, say, a program binary, which is the second box there. This is the Java binary that is the new compressor that I'm presenting. And then that's again different from, say, markup languages or sort of the thing in between what humans and computers talk about. So the third box there is the slide source code of the very slide you're looking at. And if I change the slide, then the source code also changes. So why is it difficult to model sequences? It's difficult because the space of sequences is very large. And we may be interested in some sequences that don't even fit into our memory. And so it's sort of difficult to think about compressing such sequences. And then, of course, different sequences also have, as said, very different properties. For example, DNA has very, very different sorts of properties than text has. So the myth of a universal file compressor doesn't really hold, because the sort of assumptions we make about one file may be very different about other files. And of course, there's no end to how complex the structure in a sequence can get. It's an AI complete task. So, we can always do better. So let's talk a little bit about models that work on sequences. So here, we're taking a machine learning approach. So imagine we have a probability distribution over sequences. So we have discrete symbols, x1 to xn. We have n of them, and essentially we're assigning a probability to any particular sequence, and also implicitly its length. What are these models useful for? Well, obviously compression, because that's what we're talking about, but also anomaly detection. We can use it for smart entry methods like Dasher, for example, or on your phone. It may also be useful for sequence synthesis. Imagine you have a cheap DNA reader and you can only afford to read the sequence once. You may want to have a probabilistic model that guesses well what the things are that you're missing. It's also helpful in other applications like OCR and so on. Of course, you can imagine any algorithm that takes a piece of text and then converts it compresses it somehow. You can imagine doing all sorts of string substitutions. You can, run automata. You can try and find repetitions and then do something with it. No matter what you do, if you have a mapping from a sequence to a code, then that can be interpreted as a probabilistic model. And that's because the output has a length, And if you have e to the minus of that length, then that gives you a probability distribution where z is your normalizing constant. So really anything you do to sequences, as long as you preserve every piece of information, is really a probability distribution. And there are some famous algorithms that work on that principle. For example, there's gzip, which I'm sure you all know. There are various others as well. So the question is, how well can we compress? So if you look at a sequence like this, for example, that should look familiar. That's the binary expansion of pi. It seems clear that that's very easy to regenerate. So you just need a few lines of code, essentially, to be able to regenerate that sequence. But how do we know it's pi when we see an arbitrary file? So that's where essentially strong AI would come in. We'd have to be able to crack any algorithm and reverse engineer what is the shortest program that could possibly generate the data. No one knows how to do it. Not for lack of trying, but it's just really hard. And it doesn't make any difference if you choose E instead. And ultimately, we're always bound by the problem that if we don't understand what's in the data, then our model has no chance of modeling it. So here, maybe we can crack the pseudo-random number generator and its seed, and then regenerate that sequence, but that's pretty hopeless. And if we manage, then we'd have other things to worry about, I'm sure. So how does the sequence model work? Well, we assign a probability to a sequence and its length, and so essentially sequence models are inherently non-parametric models. And we can always factorize such a distribution as follows, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if we come up with a wacky model, that second part, these conditional distributions, that product of conditional distributions, is necessarily easily accessible or cheap to compute. The interesting models for us, though, they make it cheap to compute. So let's start simple. Let's say that every character is just independently modeled. We have some probability distribution over characters, and then we take our sequence and we model each character independently of what has happened before. Then, of course, real sequences aren't like that. And for example, English text has a particular distribution over letters. So this is when we just count unigrams. And we'll see that, for example, E is the most frequent letter. And that doesn't mean that we should hard code this, because ultimately we may want to compress other languages too. So it's not clear what to do. So what we want to do is learn that distribution. We want to learn a histogram, namely this histogram, and we want to learn it from the data. And so I'm going to use the notation curly m to write down a multiset of essentially this histogram of all the symbols and its occurrence counts. So there's something called the Dearest process. I'm sure you've heard of it. And it's really nifty because all it does is it collects these counts and it forms a distribution over symbols. So we can condition on, say, a bunch of symbol observations, and then that gives us a probability distribution over what might happen next. So it learns, essentially, that histogram. And we can do that, but we do not actually learn contextual dependencies, which in English is what it's all about. We don't really believe that if we take our text of Shakespeare, sort it by letter, having all the A's come first, then all the B's, then all the C's, then all the D's, we don't believe that that should be the same as in its original configuration. So we want to exploit the fact that there is structure. And we do that by putting in some context. So bigram distributions would work as follows. We'd say, what is the probability distribution over the next symbol, given that the previous symbol was a particular value, say an E, or a Q. So after a Q in English, we'd expect to have a spike on U, even though overall U would not be a spike in the histogram. And then, of course, we can push that idea a bit further. And instead of just conditioning on, say, one letter, we condition on 3 letters or more. And now we're talking. Now we're sort of getting to an interesting proposition that we could use to build a compressor. And it's very nice and flexible. And more contexts mean, unfortunately, also that each histogram is a lot sparser. So it doesn't really get trained very much. And that ultimately means that we're bad at compressing, because just because we haven't seen, say, BLI before, shouldn't mean that we don't know what to do. Maybe we've seen LI before or I before and make use of that hierarchical information. So that's what we'll do. We'll use the fact that there's some sort of hierarchical relationship going on, because at least for human text, we fundamentally believe that the characters that follow a given context or a given sequence of characters is similar in some way to the next shorter context. And that can be expressed by, again, revisiting our dp, by making it hierarchical. So instead of having a uniform base distribution at the end, we will use the empirically learned distribution of the next shorter context. So this way, we're asking the longest context first to predict what the next symbol is going to be. If the long context doesn't know, we'll ask the next shorter context. And that's how we're generating data, and that's how we're learning all these hierarchical histograms. So now we have lots of histograms, and they're sparse, and information is shared between them. So for example, if in a longer context we learn, then we can exploit the fact that the shorter context also learns. But a DP isn't really the best way of doing this. So in the past, people have used something called the Pittman-Yor process, which extends the DP by adding one more parameter. Don't worry, we don't have to worry about these details here. Just one thing that sort of led to, one step that led to this nice new compressor was to realize that actually a Pittman-Yor process is very expensive to do inference in once it's hierarchical. That's because it has latent state that isn't really giving us much, but costs us a lot. So we have to do Gibbs sampling over latent seating allocations of restaurants and all sorts of things that we don't really want to do. The good news is we can simplify it. If we don't care exactly about the table counts, it does just as well at compressing in practice, but we now have a sort of deterministic allocation, and that makes it a lot easier. Again, if you're interested in the details, you can talk to me later. Oh yeah, one thing that I also wanted to mention is there's a question of how deep we should go. So we all agree that it's a good idea that we should condition on more than just one character or more than just two characters. We should condition on context, but how deep should we go? And it turns out that, so this is the compression rate in bits per symbol on a long file. These are all of Shakespeare's plays. And unfortunately, he stopped writing at 5 megabytes, roughly. And one thing that's sort of interesting to see is that, for example, here, there's the green line that does best. So with context depth 5, we now compress the best. But then in the end, as we see more data, depth 6 starts to have a better compression rate. And that's because Shakespeare has written more plays, and we've seen more data. We've populated more histograms. Of course, if he had kept writing, hopefully, then D7 could have been the next line to win. But he stopped writing, so that's a problem. So this hierarchical architecture is nice because information is effectively shared, and the simplified Pittman-Yor process is really good for modeling the histograms, and it's cheap to do inference in it. And now, of course, we should worry about how should we set the parameters, because they clearly matter. And so there was the strength parameter, theta, and then the discount parameter, who knows how to pronounce it, and they have to be set. And perhaps one thing that we also believe is that some histograms are really different from others. So for example, you could imagine that at the beginning of a sentence, you have a very different distribution over characters than, say, in the middle of a word. Maybe we can infer which of these situations are the case and do the right thing. So how can we do that? Clearly, we could sort of have one parameter for each possible context, but that's difficult because the more parameters we have, the more we need to learn, or the more we need to know how to set them. But we could make the parameters depend on context depth. That means that the longer our context is, we just look at the length, we choose a different set of parameters, a different concentration, different discount. And then maybe somehow we can learn how to set them. Then the second idea is perhaps it matters how many observations we had, and depending on how many observations we had in this context, we should choose a different parameterization. This seems weird, but there's actually some fairly old research in NLP where people had tried such wacky ideas, and they worked really well. So here in this work, we're putting all these things together to make a new model and to do both. So we're having a matrix of different parameters, and depending on how deep we are and what the fan out of our tree node is, so how many different unique things we've seen, depending on that, we go and compress. And of course, we need to know how to set the parameters, and for that, we do a gradient optimization. And ideally, we do so online. This is the math that you end up doing. It's not pretty, but it's pretty nice what it does. So we can do this online, and we get nice results. So here are some famous compressors that that people might know. I'll delete some that we don't really need. So gzip is pretty famous. Bzip is also pretty famous. The previous world best was an algorithm called PPM-II, PPM with information inheritance, by a Russian guy that was unbeaten for more than 10 years. And now we have some new models. And if we just use a context depth of 8 and just leave it at that, so note that PPM-II has context depth of 16, which is more, we already do pretty well. And this is without optimization. Once we add the optimization, then we're doing even better. And once we go to depth 16, then we really start rocking the boat. Except on these 3 files, these nasty files that I should just delete, called Kennedy, this is a binary spreadsheet, and PTT, that's a picture, and sum, it's a computer binary. All the rest is human text. We've engineered a model that's good on human text, but it pays the price for it by not being good at other things. And so, yeah, we kind of suck at the others, but we do well. Note that the Russian algorithm, which is sort of fundamentally also a PPM-like algorithm and therefore similar, also doesn't do quite as well on those files. The winner there is an algorithm called LZMA, or LZIP in Linux, or 7-zip in Windows. And it really just rocks on these files and sucks on the others. As I said in the beginning, there's no such thing as a general file compressor, except if you make 100 different models and mix them all together. And that's what PAQ does. And that's currently the world's best compressor in the world. And it comes at a huge cost because it runs, I think, in its full-powered version, 600 models at the same time. And that's not what we want to do. So if we just want to run one model, then I recommend currently N16 is the model to run. So there's a paper coming out on the matter, and it's going to be presented this April at the Data Compression Conference in Utah. Feel free to come. You can also get the preprint on my website if you're interested. I think, yeah, it's fairly on the top. So you click it and download it, and that's it. Before I stop, I think I'm going to talk about one more little fun thing. You can also use a compressor to sample. So essentially, we're having a probability distribution that gives a probability to the data. The log p is exactly the file length that you get when you compress. That's the beauty of it. Now, you can also condition on data, say, which is what the compressor does anyway when it learns more about the file that it's compressing, and then sample. And so I've done that for a few things just to show. So when I train on Alice in Wonderland, then this is what comes out. This is what the compressor imagines text looks like after all that it knows is Alice in Wonderland. So after reading Alice in Wonderland, it fantasizes models, it just fantasizes data, and that's what it looks like. Of course, that's not very compelling. It wouldn't pass the Turing test, but how about if I say, switch to Russian? Can you tell that it's not Russian? I can't. This is trained on Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Or we switch to traditional Chinese. This is a kung fu novel. Looks compelling to me. Or, well, being not a native English speaker, this is Shakespeare. So we trained on Shakespeare, all of his plays. And this is what the model fantasizes. I really like the name of the play that it thinks up. So it generates even the white space and the new lines. It generates it all. And best of all your favorite characters are all in there. It just mixes them all together. So this must have been the ultimate play. Of course, one shouldn't be too biblical about it. This is trained on the Bible. What it thinks, text looks like according to the King James version of the Bible. And so to me, this sort of looks encouraging in the sense that, for example, it doesn't know anything about words. It doesn't know anything about how your characters are encoded. It learns all this. It learns essentially Unicode. It learns how to form sentences. It even makes up new words by just sort of, combining what it thinks are likely characters to follow. And still you get some sort of interesting, coherent thing out. So it looks to me like this is, Shakespeare on drugs or the Bible on drugs, which led me to think maybe let's actually run a drug synthesis manual through the thing and get random drug synthesis instructions. So this is taken from Phenethylamines I have known and loved by the Shulgin couple, who synthesized all sorts of hallucinogenic drugs and tried them in self-experiment. And they wrote about it and published it on the internet. This is what you get when you train on that, and you get a totally delirious, incomprehensible synthesis instruction for the next big drug. Thank you very much.
Do we have time for questions?
So you mentioned that this model doesn't have any representation, say, of words or so on. Have you thought about trying to build that into the model? At the moment, it's just n-gram space on characters. Whether you could try to have like higher level structures explicitly in the model.
So the question is, have I thought about putting support in for words? Yes. I've thought about all sorts of things, and indeed making it more high level could be interesting. Yet it's sort of compelling to see how well it does just with this n-gram assumption. So there doesn't seem to be a strict need to model words explicitly. But of course I could imagine it helping. There are also languages that don't really mark their words in the text. For example, Japanese, where you don't have explicit spaces. And the question is, where do you infer where a word starts and ends? It's very interesting. If you're interested to work on this sort of thing, feel free to get in touch. Any other questions? Yes?
Is this available?
Is this available? Not yet. It will be. We've bought a website. We haven't yet set it up. We're going to present this at the Data Compression Conference, and after that, it will be available. All right, thank you very much.